Hello, we are back and we are talking about kid activists in our learning of how to make the world a better place. This next session is about Helen Keller, the mystery of language. Helen Keller is best known as an activist for the rights of people with disabilities, but she was also a radical socialist who advocated for many oppressed groups. Before she could become such a strong force for social justice, she needed to acquire language. No easy task for a deaf and blind child at a time when people with disabilities had little access to education. Helen was born on June 27, 1880 in Tuscumbia, a small town in Alabama. She was a bright and confident toddler, but at only 19 months old, she became very sick. The doctors thought she would die. Fortunately, Helen survived, but the illness left her unable to see and hear. Helen spent a lot of time on her mother's lap or holding on her skirt while she followed her around. She used gestures to make her wishes known, though she knew that other people moved their mouths to communicate. She would sometimes stand between two adults, touching their lips, and when she tried moving her own lips, no one understood her. When Helen was 5, her sister Mildred was born. Helen did not appreciate that new baby at all. Now, Mildred sat on her mother's lap and took up a lot of her mother's time and attention. As a child, Helen liked to play with a little girl named Martha Washington, who was one of the daughters of the family's cook. Martha was 2 or 3 years older, and she understood Helen's signs and gestures. Helen could be very bossy, and she knew what she wanted and was prepared to fight to get it, so she usually got her way. The two girls spent a lot of time in the kitchen. They helped make ice cream, ground coffee beans, kneaded balls of dough, and fed the hens and turkeys that gathered around the kitchen steps. One time, a turkey stole a tomato from Helen's hand and ran off with it. That gave Helen and Martha an idea. The girls took a freshly iced cake from the kitchen, carried it to the woodpile, and ate the whole thing. Afterward, Helen was very sick. Helen had fun with Martha, but she still had no language to communicate with. She often had angry outbursts and broke down in tears, frustrated and exhausted from trying to express herself. When she was 6, her parents took her to Washington, D.C. to see Alexander Graham Bell, the man who invented the telephone. He said that Helen could be educated and told them how to find a teacher. Helen later described her teacher's arrival as the most important day of her life. Anne Sullivan was 20 years old, and she was determined to help Helen communicate. On their first morning together, Anne gave Helen a doll. Taking Helen's hand, she used the manual alphabet to fingerspell D-O-L-L into it. Curious about this new game, Helen spelled D-O-L-L back to her teacher. She was very pleased with herself and ran downstairs to show her mother her new signs. She was on her way to learning language, but she did not yet understand that this combination of signs meant doll, or that there was a word to go with every object. Helen was sometimes annoyed by her new teacher's interference. She's very quick-tempered and willful, Anne wrote in a letter soon after her arrival. But Anne was patient, persistent, and firm. Over and over, she spelled the names of everyday objects into Helen's hand. Helen quickly learned to spell the words back, but she was still just imitating her teacher. A month after Anne's arrival, they had a breakthrough. Helen was holding her mug under the water spout while Anne pumped water to fill it. As the mug filled and cold water rushed over Helen's hand, Anne spelled water, W-A-T-E-R, into Helen's freed hand. Helen later described the moment in her memoir. Somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that W-A-T-E-R meant that wonderful cool something that was flowing over my hand. That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, joy, and set it free. There were barriers still, it is true, but barriers that could in time be swept away. Helen needed more than individual words, however. She needed to be exposed to language in the way most children are, by being surrounded by it. So her teacher signed her into her hands from morning to night. Using full sentences, new words, unfamiliar expressions, Helen learned rapidly. She even tried to teach her new signs to her dog, Belle, by grabbing her paws and moving her toes. Helen worked so hard that her parents and Anne became worried. She fingerspelled constantly, not even wanting to stop to eat. They took her to the doctor, who diagnosed her with an overactive mind. Anne tried to encourage Helen to slow down, but Helen was unstoppable. She began learning to read and write. She knew that Anne wrote letters in Braille to other blind children, and she began learning to write letters by herself. One day, baby Mildred managed to grab one of Helen's letters. Helen pulled the soggy paper from her sister's mouth and gave Mildred a smack. Anne swooped in and picked up the crying baby. Wrong girl did eat letter, Helen told her, fingerspelling the words. Helen did slap very wrong girl. She said that she had told Mildred no, no, no many times, and explained that Mildred did not understand Helen's signs and that she needed to be gentle with the baby. Helen ran upstairs, and when she returned, she had a letter written in Braille. She gave it to Mildred. Baby not think, she told her. Helen will give baby pretty letter. Baby can eat all the words. It was the beginning of what eventually became a close relationship between the two sisters. When Helen was almost 8, she was invited to tour the Perkins Institute for the Blind in Boston. Helen had been writing to the school's director, Michael Anagos, and without her knowledge, he had been publishing her letters. Helen was becoming known throughout the country, but she wasn't yet aware of it. She enjoyed meeting other children at Perkins, and over the next few years, she was an unofficial student at the school. She was given access to the library of Braille books, and it was through this world of literature that she began to develop an awareness of human suffering. When Helen was 11, she wrote a story called The Frost King and sent it to Mr. Agnos. He was impressed, but it soon became clear that the story was similar to one published several years earlier. Mr. Agnos accused Helen of plagiarism and had her questioned for 2 hours by a panel of judges. They eventually accepted that she had not intended to copy the story, which had been told to her when she was younger, but Helen was devastated. Soon after, she left the school. Her confidence was badly shaken, and for a while she was scared that her thoughts and words might not be her own. So Anne encouraged her to write about her own life. Helen's article began, "Written wholly without help or by any sort of a deaf and blind girl, 12 years old." During her teens, Helen continued her studies with Anne. She learned a lip read by placing her hand on the speaker's mouth and throat. And she also learned to speak. She went sailing in the summer and tobogganing in the winter. She loved to ride her horse and walk with her dogs. She met many well-known people, including the writer Mark Twain, who became a great friend and supporter. It was as a teenager that Helen began developing her ideas about social justice. Anne had grown up in great poverty. She took Helen to visit New York's Lower East Side, a poorer area where many immigrants lived. Helen was deeply moved. She found it hard to understand how wealthy people could bear to live in their fine houses while others struggled to survive. At age 20, Helen began her university studies at Radcliffe College, becoming the first deafblind person to earn a university degree. She joined the Socialist Party, writing letters and articles supporting the rights of workers and women, taking a stand against child labor. She supported the NAACP, and she fought for the rights of deaf, blind, and disabled people. She became a peace activist as well. Helen visited 35 countries, giving lectures and reaching the hearts and minds of countless people around the world. In 1964, at age 84, Helen Keller was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in recognition of her contributions to her country. In the 1800s, few educational opportunities were available for deaf people in North America. Laurent Clerc, one of the most renowned people in deaf history, played a leading role in changing that. Born in France, he studied at the National Institution for Deaf in Paris. After he graduated, he stayed on as a teacher. While at the school, he met Thomas Galilei, an American who shared his interest in education for deaf people. In 1816, both men embarked on a 52-day voyage to the United States. During the journey, Clerc taught Galilei, if I'm saying that right, sign language, and Galilei helped Clerc study English. A year later, they founded America's first school for the deaf. Clerc went on to start many other schools and was a great advocate for sign language. In fact, American Sign Language, ASL, evolved in his schools, which is why many signs have French origins. This next one is called Alexander Hamilton, an unlikely beginning. Without Alexander Hamilton, the United States might be a very different place. He was George Washington's right-hand man, and his courage and strategic thinking helped win the Revolutionary War. He was also one of the founding fathers whose ideas helped create the U.S. Constitution, but he came from the unlikeliest of backgrounds. Alexander was born in 1755 on Nevis, a steep volcanic island in the British West Indies, edged with sandy beaches and surrounded by the Caribbean Sea. It was a beautiful place, but a dangerous one, with earthquakes, tidal waves, and violent storms. Pirates sailed the waters around the island and were sometimes caught and hanged at Gallows Bay. Nevis was known as one of the Sugar Islands because its wealth came from the sugar trade. Trading ships from all over the world sailed in and out of its port. Trading ships from all over the world sailed in and out of its port, and thousands of enslaved Africans worked and suffered on its plantations. The number of enslaved people on Nevis was 8 times more than the number of white people. Alexander saw slaves being bought and sold on the auction blocks his own grandfather, a doctor, used to inspect the people who were being sold into slavery. Alexander's mother owned slaves, and he and his older brother James were masters of a young enslaved boy named Ajax. But Alexander grew up hating the brutality of slavery. It seemed morally wrong that people's lives depended not on their hard work or their abilities, but on the circumstances they were born into. As he grew older, ideas about liberty and freedom became increasingly important to him. Alexander's childhood was difficult. His parents were not married, which meant that Alexander was illegitimate and remained near the bottom of the island's social hierarchy. He and his brother were called names and forbidden from attending the church school. People were always gossiping about his mother, Rachel. As a 16-year-old, Rachel had been pressured by her mother to marry a much older man than she met while visiting relatives in the island of St. Croix. The marriage was unhappy, and after their son Peter was born, Rachel left her husband and child. Furious, her cruel husband had been thrown in jail, hoping this punishment would make her do as he wanted. Instead, when she was released, she ran away to St. Kitts, where she met James Hamilton, the man who would become Alexander's father. James Hamilton had arrived in the British West Indies from Scotland. He was from a rich family and had grown up in a castle, but as the 4th son, he would not inherit this wealth. Instead, he hoped to make a fortune in the sugar trade. Unfortunately, he wasn't very good at it. Instead of making good money, he got into debt and could not afford a ticket back to Scotland. So he took various jobs, met Rachel, and a few years later, Alexander and his brother were born. The laws at this time were very unfair to women. When Alexander was 4, Rachel's first husband divorced her. He was now free to remarry, but she was not. The divorce papers described her as shameless, rude, and ungodly. When Alexander was 9, his family moved to St. Croix, where Rachel had been in prison. Alexander soon learned about his mother's past. Everyone in town knew her history. His parents' relationship fell apart under the strain, and James Hamilton abandoned his family. Alexander never saw his father again. Rachel was intelligent, resourceful, and hardworking. She rented a house and ran a store on the ground floor. She taught Alexander and hired tutors for him too. He had more than 30 books, a huge collection for that time, from which he learned history and political philosophy. Alexander had just turned 13 when he and his mother fell ill with a fever. The doctor treated them and Alexander recovered, but Rachel did not. She died beside him in the family's only bed. That same night, only an hour after her death, officials arrived and locked away all of Rachel's possessions. Her money and everything she owned, even Alexander's books, were given to her first son, Peter. Alexander and his brother, James, could not inherit because they were illegitimate. Alexander and James went to live with a cousin who managed to purchase Alexander's books and return them to him. Sadly, he died soon after. The boys then moved in with their uncle. But in an unbelievable stroke of bad luck, he died as well. Alexander was 14 years old, his brother James was 16, and in less than a year they had lost their mother, a cousin, and an uncle. They had no home, no possessions, no money, and no one to care for them. James became apprenticed to a carpenter to learn that trade. Alexander had a good friend named Edward Stevens, whose wealthy family invited Alexander to live with them. Both boys were bright and hardworking. With their red hair and slim builds, they even looked alike. Edward eventually left for medical school in New York, but he and Alexander stayed friends throughout their lives. By the time he moved in with the Stevens family, Alexander was working as a clerk for a shipping company. He didn't like the job much, but he was very good at it, and it gave him an opportunity to learn about business and trade. When he was 16, the owner went away and left Alexander in charge of the entire company. For 5 months, Alexander negotiated deals, inspected goods, and collected money owed. He was a remarkably capable young man, and this experience only made him dream bigger. Alexander wanted to be successful and famous like the men he had read about in his history books. He was fascinated by duels, which were common at the time, and by ideas about death and honor. Years later, he would die in a duel against the American statesman Aaron Burr. Even as a teen, he desperately wanted to become a hero. I wish there was a war, he wrote in a letter to Edward, saying that he would willingly risk his life. But it was his talent with words that would become his ticket to a bigger role in the world. He sent a love poem to the local paper, which published it. A Presbyterian minister named Hugh Knox read it and was impressed. Knox reached out to Alexander and they became friends. Knox made his personal library available to Alexander so that he could continue his studies. The next summer, when Alexander was 17, the island was struck by a fierce hurricane. The storm uprooted trees and tore homes from their foundations. Boats were thrown onto shore, and the seas rose and huge waves crashed. When the terrifying storm finally ended, the damage was catastrophic. Some people had been killed and many were injured. Homes and businesses were destroyed, and food and fresh water were in short supply. Shaken, Alexander sought comfort at the church, and listened to Hugh Knox give a powerful sermon. Inspired by his words, he wrote a letter to his father. The roaring of the sea and wind, fiery meteors flying about in the air, the crash of the falling houses, and the ear-piercing shrieks of the distressed were sufficient to strike astonishment into angels. When Hugh Knox saw the letter, he urged him to publish it, giving Alexander his first taste of fame. Everyone wanted to know who this talented writer was. When they found out he was an orphan with no formal education, they were fascinated. Hugh Knox took advantage of their curiosity and collected money for his young friend's education. Such talent should not be wasted, he said. Enough funds were raised to send Alexander to the United States for college. In the fall of 1772, he boarded a ship and never looked back. After he arrived in New York City, Alexander began spending time with people who thought the United States should be independent from Britain. When Paul Revere rode from Boston to New York, bringing news that American colonists had boarded British ships and dumped tea into the harbor, Alexander began writing the political text supporting the protest. He wrote about freedom and slavery as well as the right to liberty. He was still in his teens, but he was already taking the first steps to becoming a revolutionary leader. Over the next few years, Alexander Hamilton took the nation by storm, inspiring others with his fiery words. He joined a volunteer militia to fight against the British in the Revolutionary War, helped ratify U.S. Constitution, and became the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury. He was committed to building something lasting and just in government, and his legacy lives on today. Many young people fought on the battlefields of the Revolutionary War in the 1770s. Teens were viewed differently than they are now. If you were not a child, then you were an adult. Both the American and the British armies included teenage boys and a few girls too. One such girl soldier was 16-year-old Deborah Sampson. Pretending to be a boy, Deborah fought against the British for 3 years. Another 16-year-old girl who played an important role was Sybil Ludington. Like Paul Revere, she rode her horse through the night, knocking on doors and alerting the militia to the approach of the British. And we are going to start chapter 4. See you next time.